So you've also done a lot of work with regards to CMMC. Do you want to tell us about what CMC is and how it interrelates with NIST and ISO 27001 or 27001?
You hear it said both ways. Yeah, CMMC is going to go down, I think, in InfoSec history is perhaps the most significant standard of perhaps of all time. That might sound like hyperbole, and it is, but I actually think it might actually be. So CMMC started life as, it's called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And CMMC started life because in 2015, the Defense Industrial Base, or the DoD, said, hey, we've got 350,000 odd companies in our defense industrial base, our defense supply chain. And we need to make sure that they're properly protecting data because we're bleeding. I think the number is $650 million worth of intellectual property every year because they're not very secure. To that, the F-35, I think it was called, jet, which it took us 15 years and $1 billion to build. The Chinese were flying one that looks remarkably like it down to wingtip dimensions 2 years later. So they said, this isn't good. So in 2015, roughly, they came out with something called NIST SP 800-171, which was mandated by a DFARS clause. The DCMA runs the budget and purchasing, Defense Contract Management Association, and there are these clauses called DFARS. And it said, hey, you need to prove you're secure to us. And the way we're going to ask you to prove you're secure is comply to this NIST SP 800-171, and that's the 110 good security practices that should protect what we call CUI, controlled unclassified information. So the way that they were going to prove it is you were going to get a piece of newspaper or lunch bag and get a crayon and put an X on it and send it to us. And now we'll know you're actually doing what you're doing.
Sounds like a good system.
Yeah, shockingly, it didn't work. There was no enforcement. It was fully like honor system.
Maybe it was the wrong crayon.
Yeah, they should use marker because that's permanent. A crayon you can erase.
So self-attestation.
Yes, exactly. That's the fancy word for it. Yep. So that didn't work. They said, we're going to up the game a little bit, and we're basically going to make you be subject to a third-party audit to validate that you're implementing these controls. And while we're doing that, why don't we make this a little bit more robust? So why don't we give you a CMMC level 1 option, which is good for what we call federal contract information, which is information that doesn't rise to the same level of treatment or risk as CUI, but still needs to be protected. And that's what CMMC level 1 is, and it covers 17 controls which are necessary to do that. We'll take CUI and we'll still hold it to 800-171, but we're going to add a few more controls to it. So we went from 110 controls to 130 controls. But we're going to have a more formal way that we look at the processes necessary to ensure that those practices are being properly implemented. That's where the maturity concept comes in. So now we're up to 130 controls and 51 processes that we look at, or 130, they call them practices or controls. And then we'll also add a level 5, and that's going to be for really super high risk systems. Think about space stuff, think about munitions. And that's a level 5, and that's up to 171 controls, with the big difference being that the 41 additional controls are largely focused on what we call advanced persistent threat. So that's CMMC in a nutshell, and where now it's getting even more interesting. So you say to yourself, okay, 350,000 organizations, the rough number is probably 40 or 50,000 of them probably fall into CMMC level 3. Well, to put that in perspective, we probably have 40 or 50,000 ISO 27001 certificates in the world that have been issued since 2005. So now you're saying, hey, we're going to have the same number of organizations have to comply with a similarly complex standard in a 4-year, 5-year period. So that's why it's such a big deal. And here's where it gets bigger. So the bigger is that CUI is defined by NARA, National Archives and Records Association. And CUI is not just DoD data. Student information is CUI, and lots of other data that we operate on every day. So any agency that has CUI is suddenly going, we could use this. So now what happens is, so we heard talk about OCIE and SEC using this. So there's open talk about it being used as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley program, which would mean that every public company would have some level of CMMC going on. Department of Homeland Security was quoted last week as saying they're going to issue contracts this year. They're going to require CMMC. And then lastly, last week, if you're familiar with FERPA, which is the standard which applies to student records or CUI. So all of the institutes of higher education have been put on notice that you should start looking at NIST SP 800-171 and CMMC because we're going to start using that. And then lastly, and perhaps most important, GSA, the Government Services Administration, which is the entity that procures most IT services for the federal agencies, included it in their Polaris contract explicitly. So anyone who's going to bid to be an MSP, an IT services provider, provide IT services to the government, in theory, is going to need to be conformant with. So that's where I look at this thing and say, holy shite, where is this going?